So I'll give you the floor, Kirsten Drotner, and you may speak of other things you have done.
Thank you. Thank you.
The floor is yours.
So thank you, Annika, for this generous introduction. I hope I can speak up so that you may hear without further problems, or else just raise your hand and we'll see how it goes. Today I'll be speaking about a specific area that is very close to my heart in terms of children's appropriations of digital media. As you can see, the title is Children's Freedom of Speech in the 21st Century, and this is what will be the focus of my talk. But I won't start with exactly the freedom of speech, but with some key discourses in children's media uses. And most of us have been here over 1.5 days already, and we have shared what is going on in the various Nordic countries, and we have also shared public discourses about digital childhood, about what is happening in children's everyday lives when digital media are everywhere. My claim today is that the public discourses are, in a sense, mirrored also in parts of the research literature, in the sense that we see a kind of binary discourse, and one is, of course, the very optimistic discourse that was kind of coined by Mark Prensky about digital natives, that all children who are born today are born with a mobile in their hands, and they practically know everything there is to know about how to handle the digital world, and their parents are digital immigrants, and so we have a reverse situation. That was his key claim, that in a sense the younger generation now has to teach the older generation, and those of us who work at universities have to take note of the fact that a whole new breed of young people are coming into the university, so we better change our ways of teaching right away. As many of you will know, this kind of binary has been studied, it has been critiqued, not least by people who have thought about making a distinction between digital activities and digital competences. So, for example, Ellen Helsper at London School of Economics have made very large quantitative studies where she's studied media competences across generations. And what she claims, and I think that's very valid, is that you cannot equate very high activity in terms of adoption of the latest digital technologies with a similar competence in those technologies. So she urges us to, in a sense, make this distinction that sometimes, for example, you'll see older generations being just as media competent as younger generations, even if their media uses don't display that kind of uptake of the latest technologies. And so what Ellen Helsper and others have found is that it's often social differentials that play out when it comes to digital media competences. So Mark Prensky, I think, resonates a kind of optimistic discourse that we also see in popular discourse, in policy discourses, about the kind of revolutionary potential of the uptake of digital media and digital technologies. Then we have another binary, which is the more pessimistic discourse, and that has come to the fore, I think, much more to the fore in recent years. And one of the people who have sort of bridged the popular discourse and the research literature is Jean Twenge, and that's why I put her up here. Why today's super-connected kids are growing up less rebellious, more tolerant, less happy, and completely unprepared for adulthood. And she calls it the iGen, and she has other publications like that. And what she claims, of course, is that particularly the use of the iPhone is destroying an entire generation. So in a sense, she mirrors Mark Prensky's generational divides, but she has another conclusion, and she focuses very much on ill health and psychological problems and so on, and brain damage and stress, all kinds of illnesses or psychological problems that they, and not just Jean Twenger, but many others, claim are directly correlated to the use of the mobile phone. The critique here in other parts of the research literature is that, yes, you can see a correlation between stress and the functioning of the brain, but you cannot make a direct correlation between that function of the brain and then the use of the mobile phone. There may be other additional causes, and there may be other additional factors into play that, so this kind of direct correlation, as far as I've read the critical literature, cannot be made. But of course, this very negative outcome of the focus on ill health mirrors a very obvious popular discourse that we see not least in policy circles, and not just in the Nordic countries but around the world. And I'm sure you all followed when the French Parliament last August banned all use of mobile phones in school, with the exception of when it's used directly for as a teaching material. So we have these binaries, I'd claim, not merely in the popular discourse, but also in the research literature. And the third kind of discourse that I'd like to point to is what I would call the tech discourse. And that is also a very popular discourse, but it also resonates in the research literature. And I put up here an image of a very widespread phenomenon in Denmark called coding pirates, where kids can come and learn, just like maker spaces, but these are just coding spaces. They can go to libraries, they can go to after-school programs, and now this whole phenomena is now also introduced into school in a very big way. So over the last 2 years, this has really picked up in practice to the extent that it's now integral to the primary and lower secondary school in Denmark, which is up to the age of 16. So you need to have basic coding skills, basic skills in programming, and the underlying assumption is that if you have these technical skills, then you'll be able to tackle whatever issues are out there in terms of handling your everyday life with digital technologies and media. So this kind of technology, I'd say the technology-focused discourse adds to the binary discourse that I already talked about. I think as researchers, we need to ask always to be critical and to also be self-critical. So what interests me here is these really, really widespread discourses. What sort of questions are not asked by these discourses? What is it we don't get to know if we follow these research traditions? And I'd point to two very important questions that are not asked. One is about the commodification of children's lives in terms of the take-up of digital technologies that are largely, as we all know, governed by big corporate, largely American corporations. Children leave lots and lots of data. They pay lots and lots of money, or their parents pay lots and lots of money, and with very little insight into what goes on, with very little power to, in a sense, begin to negotiate with these big companies. So what happens in this type of issue with the commodification of digital media and technologies is that we individualize the issues so that parents now have to sit home with their children negotiating whether or not they can have a YouTube account even if they're not 13 years old and that sort of thing. So that's one issue that I think we need to ask ourselves about, and which is not really raised by these predominant issues. The other issue is about children's freedom of speech. And this is what I'll focus on today. So I'll leave aside the commodification, the datafication, the platformization of children's lives with digital media. But I will focus on what I think is another important question that is not asked in these predominant research discourses, namely the whole freedom of expression, or if you do ask about freedom of expression in terms of children, it's often that this needs to be curtailed for their own good. And so I think some of us would have to, and I'm very keen to study this, begin to ask questions about what are the conditions of children's freedom of expression in a platform society. And I think we need to maybe begin to have that dialogue by asking ourselves about what media and information literacy is, because it is very central to the whole question of children's freedom of expression. Because as we all know, media and information literacy is generally thought of as the ability to experience and understand what comes to children and other people in the world in terms of media content that has been produced by others. It's an ability to analyze what all of this means, to, in a sense, have the meaning-making capacity and analytical capacity to digest and turn information into knowledge. That is kind of one of the key claims of the knowledge society, which I think we still need to hold on to in terms of media and information literacy. And last but not least, media and information literacy also involves to create and reflect on what you create. And this is where media and information literacy links up to children's freedom of expression, because it's very difficult to think about how you can express yourself today as a child without the requisite resources to use digital media to create, to produce, to have a voice in terms of the digital society, the platform society. And here I use the term media and information literacy following on from UNESCO, UNESCO's inclusive definition. But as we all know, there are lots and lots of what I call hyphenated literacies out there. So some people talk about information literacy, others talk about digital literacy, others talk about media literacy. There are lots of, as I say, hyphenated concepts out there. But if you think about how they link together, I mean, they all have these kind of key elements, and this is why I think the UNESCO definition is useful, because it's fairly inclusive. It's also important to know that in this hierarchy, if you like, it's not the level of competence formation differs. So the lowest competence is involved in actually understanding what goes on a screen. Even very small children can understand that. Even a 2-year-old understands that if you have a kind of animated film and somebody is run over by a truck, they'll pop up again. It's not real. So experience and understand requires the lowest level of competence, whereas create and reflect is the most difficult, but I'd say it's also the most vital when it comes to children's modes of expression. So if we think about media and information literacy and competence formation, I want to spend a bit of time in unpicking this concept because I think it has research implications in terms of how we nuance our understanding of media and information literacy. So we, because those of us who come from the Nordic countries, some of us have imported from English the terms competence, and it's not exactly the same as skills. So I mean, we need to unpick some of these terms. We also in the Nordic countries talk about Dannelse, or coming from the German Bildung, which is a fairly different notion from the term competence. So just saying media and information literacy is a competence, I think this kind of generalization needs unpicking. And particularly from a Nordic context, I think the kind of educational history that we've had have had a kind of balance between children being competent or educated to be competent and children being educated to be builded or have character formation so that they can operate in a democratic society. So competence, as most of you will know, and many of you have researched, is about concrete skill. It often has a task focus. It's often geared towards work life, and it's often quantifiable, testable outcomes, whereas Bildung, Dannelse, is a much more, in some sense, some would say it's much more flurry concept, although I personally question that. I think it's, but I mean, to focus on Bildung or Dannelse, this is a broader concept to do with how we navigate in democratic societies, how we navigate as people, in our family life, in our civic society, in terms of policy making, and I mean in terms of understanding the world in a sense. And the reason I'll question it is that I think that competence has had much more research focus in a systematic way over the last 10-15 years than Bildung, and I'll come back to that in just a little while. So Bildung is this broader concept that I think we need to include when we talk about media and information literacy. And Bildung, I think, is what Albert Einstein once said, Bildung is everything you remember when you forget what you learned at school. And I think this is a famous quote, but I think it still rings true. So it is about these broader life skills or character formation or whatever you want to call it. So where are we today? I think we have a kind of binary in international terms, in terms of the kind of trends of focusing on competence versus focusing on more sort of Bildung aspects in the educational system. We all know that the PISA rankings promote a focus on competence formation, on everything that is testable. It's very much about drilling and skilling, teaching for the test. It may not have been how OECD, who originated PISA, thought about how it should be used, but in many, many policy circles, this is how it's used, and it trickles down into educational practice. So this is a very strong kind of educational trend today. And it also means that if you have this focus, it means that the introduction of new media technologies in education doesn't necessarily change the way we do school. So that's why I put this image of students in front of a computer. I mean, they may look at a computer, but they could just as well look at a teacher or into a book, because it's, I mean, the setup, the way of organizing the school setting is very similar. And in many cases, we see the introduction of digital technologies as something that just paves the way for more effective drilling and skilling, and doesn't really change the way students interact or the way in which they learn. But of course, we also have the other trend, maybe less prominent, about using new media and new ways of organizing information, gaining knowledge, analyzing knowledge, and so on, in new ways as a kind of transformative catalyst to change the way in which the educational system is working. So, for example, in Singapore, as you well know, Singapore, like Finland, are really up there when it comes to the success rate in PISA testings. So in Singapore, you now have inquiries about how you can promote more creative learning, more project-based learning, more student-focused learning. I don't know how it has played out in reality, but I mean, it's an indication that, you know, there are, in some educational circles, a realization that there are limits to how this drilling and skilling can in a sense, prepare students in a good way towards 21st century skills. So, I mean, how does this, these two binary trends in education, how does this relate to media and information literacy? I think it's really important to see that when new media are introduced, or some of you will call it new technologies, digital technologies are introduced into education, as I said, it don't necessarily change the way education plays out. And this means that new media technologies, the way in which media and information literacy is really taught, is often at the lower levels. It's often how to get access, how to use, analyze, how to effectively use information, collate information, make quality assessments about your sources and that sort of thing. So these elements, I would say, are at the two lower rungs on the pyramid that I described to you before. And this means that where we are today in terms of introducing media and information literacy with digital tools in the school system, also in the Nordic countries, still, I think, has something lacking in terms of also really developing the most difficult and I'd say the most fundamental rung, which is about children's own tools of production. And and this is important because we are in can somebody give me some water, please? Because in the Nordic countries, we have a very strong tradition of children having a say in the a democratic society. We have a very strong tradition in having at least a discourse, and I think for a long time also a practice in having children participate in their own school. We have student councils and so on. We have a long tradition of youth councils. So we have a tradition, not least in the Nordic countries, of respecting children's voices and thinking about the importance of helping children not just have a voice because they have a voice, but also help them to publicize this voice to the larger society. And this resonates very, very clearly with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child from 1989. And I will highlight Article 13, and where it says that the child should have the right to freedom of expression, and this right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of the child's choice. I think this is 1989. As I see it, this is a very kind of forward-looking article, because it says across frontiers, and it includes not only to receive information, but also to impart information. That means to express yourself so that others will understand what you're saying. It also includes, or it sort of opens up for all kinds of media being included in this process through any other media, writing, print, art, but I mean it opens up for any other media. So of course even in 1989, only Berners-Lee maybe knew about the internet, but anyway, and a few others. But anyway, it is inclusive and forward-looking in the sense that, excuse me, that it underlines children's right of freedom of expression and the right to use whatever medium comes to hand. Lovely, thank you. But of course, this freedom of expression doesn't come in and of itself. It has to be learned. If you go back 200 years, children needed to write in order to be able to express themselves. And so we need to think about how digital tools, how we help children today, also in the educational system and beyond the educational system, how we help children to get the requisite kind of learning and training so that they can express themselves also through digital means. And I think this is then really important that we begin to think very carefully about what sort of tools are at hand today in order to gain this sense of being able to express oneself so that others may understand what is going on. We have heard a lot about, as I said before, ways in which we can use material digital tools to collaborate and to make new things. The kind of material productions that, for example, makerspaces enable children to create are very, very important in terms of children's creativity. Then material digital or digitized objects are really important in terms of children collaborating, talking about what they do, so they can be catalysts of expression. Then we have coding or computer-enabled technical skills. So coding skills or skills in using the technology, well, I think we can equal that to learning a grammar. If you think about having, learning a second, not your mother tongue, but you're learning a second language, you'll often learn the grammar. This is the rules for how, on the basis of which you can express yourself. So coding is a useful grammar for expression. But then we have what I would call real semiotic means of expression. And these are absolutely central to children's means of expression. And these would be images, sound, and of course both still and live images. It could be sound as we speak here, but it could also be digitized sound. So these semiotic means of expression are specific tools that we need, I think, to be careful to distinguish, for example, from material tools, because what is so specific about semiotic tools is that they are tools of meaning making. They're direct tools of meaning making. I mean, in a makerspace, the material tools is an indirect means of meaning making. You can talk about what you're doing. But if you, for example, make photos or upload a YouTube video or something, the production process incorporates semiotic resources as meaning-making tools. And that is a direct way of training to use the tools for personal expression. And so I think I want to stress that if we think broadly about how children incorporate tools, also digital tools, we need to have a very inclusive definition. But if we want to hone in on how we can help children enhance their freedom of expression in the 21st century, we need to hone in on semiotic tools of expression. And so I want to take you to two projects that I've been involved in that did exactly that, trained children's tools of semiotic expression through the production of film. And the first is a project called Filmportal Fyn. So it's Film Portal Fyn, and Fyn is an area of Denmark in the middle of the country, actually. And what we did in this project was that we followed teachers who were going to be trained to then teach their students about filmmaking. So it was a two-way process. First, 3 groups of primary and lower secondary school teachers were trained by professional filmmakers, so they would be, the photographer, the editor, the sound, the visuals, everything. I mean, so there were 6 or 8 professional filmmakers training teachers in 3 areas: mother tongue language, Danish, visual communication, billedkundskab, and music. So these 3 types of teachers, they had to work together. And first of all, they were trained together, and then they were going to then make small films with their students. So we came in as researchers in the second part of the program, or of the project, where we followed what went on when teachers came into the classroom and organized their sessions with the kids. And we followed 3 bands of students from 0 to 2nd grade, from 5th to 6th grade, and from 9th to 10th grade. So it's kind of the little ones, the middle ones, and the older ones. The children could work with different types of genres, but there were some obstacles. They had to use the school room setting, and they couldn't go out into the streets, or because for security reasons it had to be inside the school. So they had to be prompted to, in a sense, keep some limits. And then we followed the interaction between the students, the interaction between students and teachers, and the interaction between teachers. So in the, when the teachers came out into the classroom, they were all 3 of them together. So there was also an interesting kind of collaborative process in terms of knowledge sharing and knowledge development across disciplines. What I want to focus on, I could talk a lot about the, and I'm happy to, in I hope the Q&A session, to talk more about what happened between the teachers, but here I want to focus on what happened with the students. And I'll just, as an intro, give you a little clip from one of the films that the youngest group produced. The youngest group, the 0 grade to 2nd grade, worked together in groups, and they all had one theme, which was circus. So everybody had to make a little script, or at least discuss what the film should be about, and then they had to make stop motion to make the film, and the result, I hope, will play here, if we can get it working. I think you can recognize the type of humor you have when you're about 6 or 8. But I also think that this is a very good indication of very young children, in fact, getting the resources to master a very kind of classical narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a twist, even a twist in the tail in the end. And of course, the immediate question one may ask, oh yeah, but what was the kind of collaboration between the teacher and the children? Wasn't it just the teacher who said, just as we heard earlier today, some of us, you know, you reduce the kind of very elaborate meaning-making processes that children may have, and then the teacher says, oh yeah, but we'll do it this way. But this is not what happened. I mean, what we found was, in a sense, that particularly the young children were very creative, and they sort of retained ownership of their creativity to a much larger extent than the older ones, and particularly the oldest group was very result-oriented, very goal-oriented, asking teachers, why do we have to spend 3 days on this project? Is this part of our exam project? Will we be graded? They had this kind of, I'd say, external view on education, on their own learning, whereas the young ones, they just went ahead. And this actually meant that often the youngest, the production in the youngest age band were the more successful, because they retained ownership and they questioned the teacher about what went on and what was going to happen. In general, what we found in this project is that, very importantly, these types of processes operate as great catalysts of social inclusion. Children with difficulties, children who have learning problems, social problems, personal problems, they get a new role to play. And we had, hang on, I'll see how many we had. We had over 600 children, 44 teachers, and 10 schools. So I mean, it's a kind of solid. It's not just that we went out to 2 schools. I mean, it's kind of solid. And just to give you one indication, where we followed a group, this was the middle band, so these would be kind of what, 9 to 11 years old, I think. And there was one boy in particular who he couldn't really engage with the production process. He was interrupting all the time. He wasn't really contributing. And then the teacher said, do you know what, Carl? We really need some sound of birds. Couldn't you just pop outside the classroom, just go into the schoolyard, and here's my mobile, and you can get some sound from birds. And so he went out, and he was very dedicated. He came in, and then he could contribute. He got a special role to play, and that meant that the other children saw him shine, and they got a different, or they saw him in a different role. And of course, this may not change his entire school career, but I think it's a good indication that children get a different perception of their peers, and not least teachers get a different perception of their students. So this is very important. Also, because there is no right and wrong when you make these kinds of productions, it also, I think, opens for a different way of thinking about learning as something that is not just goal-oriented, as I said, but also process-oriented and fun. And so a lot of the students had really, really strong resilience in overcoming difficulties. It could be overcoming difficulties in terms of the technology that didn't work. It could be overcoming difficulties in terms of discussing what the film should be about or when to do what. And so rather than having social conflicts between peers, they would have conflicts that were out here, in a sense, because it's all about, we all want the film to be good and we all want a film. So they had something in common that they wanted to strive for, and therefore the social conflicts were, in a sense, transformed into discussions maybe about composition or the narrative or whatever. And this gave children a kind of hiatus in terms of resolving what were, in a sense, social conflicts. But it also gave them the option to experience resilience and joint resilience. We can do this together. We may disagree, but we can do this together. So this was some of the important findings from that project. And the other project I want to mention is a project that I did with the Danish Film Institute, and it's also a film project, and it was focused on how to have children develop media and information literacy for cultural citizenship. And the Danish Film Institute has, like many other film institutes, not least in the Nordic countries, but also in the UK, they have several programs directed at schools. One is a very popular national program where students can go in school time to the closest cinema and then watch a film that is distributed by the Danish Film Institute, and that gives children or students the options of watching films and narrative expressions and aesthetic expressions that are beyond the kind of Anglo-American mainstream, what they get on Netflix and the Disney Channel and so on and so forth. And about 80% of all schools subscribe to this in Denmark, 650,000 students. So this is a very, very kind of fundamental way of offering resources for children to experience and understand digital expressions or narrative expressions, film expressions. But the Film Institute also wants to develop resources for what I would call the upper rung of media and information literacy, which is film production. So in the Danish Film Institute, they are located in central Copenhagen. They have 5 production studios, and so in this project we followed all the kind of activities that the Danish Film Institute offer, including this going to the cinema. But I'll focus on the part of the project that where we studied what goes on when students come with their teacher to this, it's called Film X, these 5 studios that are located in the at the Danish Film Institute in central Copenhagen. And so you can see how many schools participated, how many students, and again we divided children up in different age bands. And so I don't have a video, don't expect anything nice here. I'll just talk you through our key findings. So what we find is that when children come to the studios, as I said, there are 5 different studios. There's an animation studio, there's a stop motion studio, and then there are 3 live action studios. And they all have kind of back projections that invite particular ways of taking that studio in. So for example, you may have a back projection of a train or something like that. And so you also, in addition to the 5 studios, you have a kind of play area where children can dress up and so on. And so what I would like to stress as one key finding is that we see a kind of constant negotiation, I'd say, between children wanting to stay in the play area and dress up and take pictures from their own mobile phones about just dressing up, and then having them move into the studio to produce a film. And they have all prepared from home what the film should be about, who should be the director, who should be the sound, who should be the photographer, and so on. But of course, once you come into the studio, everything, or something at least, has to change, because the studio doesn't look the way you thought it would, or you don't have the necessary props or whatever. So there's a constant negotiation about, again, amongst the students and the professional guides, because what is what is characteristic of the Danish Film Institute Film X Studios is that teachers practically stand at the door. I mean, physically, they stand at the door and they don't really interact in the production process, but they have the Danish Film Institute have professional guides who can sort of help children along, but they also have a philosophy which you will recognize from kind of Nordic knowledge or Nordic discourses about children, that children know best and we have to help them as little as possible. So there's a lot of negotiation amongst children, but there's also a lot of playfulness. And what we see is, again, as I said in the other project, a kind of differential between the older age bands, particularly the oldest, which is very goal-oriented, and then the youngest ones, which are more into studying the processes and being very playful. What is important for the Danish Film Institute, and what we also saw, was that modes of expression go together with modes of reflection in the production process. So we saw that that children, you know, they can see in camera, once they've shot a scene, they can see in camera what went on. And so they would discuss, was this the right way of doing it? Should we make another take, or should we move this to another, you know, in another direction or whatever? So they have modes of expression and modes of reflection going together. And I think this is an important insight, because we often, in media and education literacy, make very clear distinction about analyzing and being critical and then expressing oneself. And what we saw in this project, and in a sense also in the other that I described before, is that there's a constant vacillation with children in the production process. But we also noticed that teachers, as I said, they remain at the door, but the guides are often very, very hesitant to pick up on these reflections. So there's a kind of learning opportunity missed, I think, in these production processes. But very importantly, what children experienced here was that using the semiotic tools as means of expression is not the same as cultural citizenship. To have a voice, to express oneself, doesn't necessarily mean that others will listen or that others will understand. So I think this is an important take-home message for those of us who are researchers, that we need to make clearer distinctions between children's voices and cultural citizenship, or even democratic citizenship, because cultural citizenship and democratic citizenship is also about not just being heard, but also getting a response back. And maybe sometimes you realize I was misunderstood or I disagree. So citizenship, it's not about agreeing, but it's about maybe agreeing to disagree, or getting a forum where you understand that once you express yourself, you also get something back. So what we studied at the Danish Film Institute was very much this process for children of transforming what they already have from the leisure culture about, I'll post it, I'll do that, but no, there's somebody out there who may respond, and you may not get the response that you thought you would. And this was this kind of realization for many students was very clear when students showed their final films, not just to their teachers, but also to other students participating. They would be asked questions that they didn't, that they hadn't realized would be important. So I think what we need to think about here is the way in which we can use projects like these, and there are many more out there. I've just taken the ones that I was personally involved in, to think about how we may use the results from these projects in terms of advancing media and information literacy as semiotic resources, and thereby advancing children's freedom of expression in the 21st century. And I think that there we need to go back to my initial slide about how the media and information literacy operates today in many educational systems, that we still are at the lower rungs, and we also not just are at the lower rungs, but these lower rungs are often, I mean, digital media and digital technologies are introduced to reinforce existing forms of schooling rather than transforming schooling. So I think we need to begin to take some of the results from our projects back into a dialogue with not just teachers and practitioners, but also leaders of education and policymakers. For example, in terms of the way in which school is organized, you cannot make a film in 45 minutes. I mean, teaching lessons are 45 minutes in Denmark. Interdisciplinary collaboration. Also what we found, and this is the only thing I'll mention about the teachers' collaboration, was that teachers found it very, very difficult to lead creative processes because they found these filmmaking processes to be messy. And they didn't feel they had sufficient control about what was going on and what would happen next. They were out of their comfort zone. And so what we found was that it's actually very important to also include, if we want to enhance children's freedom of expression also within the educational system, we need to also work in teacher training with leading creative processes. And now I have given examples from semiotic resources, but I think makerspaces would be another area where we would probably find the same obstacles. And last but not least, I think it's very evident that today many of the skills needed for freedom of expression, particularly with semiotic resources, children train these beyond the school gates. So we need to work much, and this is another thing I think is very important, we need to work much more closely with cultural institutions, with networks beyond the school gate. So I think, okay, you get this image, and I'll switch to my concluding slide, which I think is, in a sense, very simple. Move up the pyramid, be much more attentive to how the educational system and other learning networks can help children advance their acquisition of the semiotic tools necessary for living and working and living well and having fun in the 21st century. And I think this involves, I think, a whole raft, in a sense, of initiatives, from working with teachers in very practical terms to working with policymakers about how we do school and everything in between, working with school leaders, working with local communities, and each of us, each researcher cannot do everything like this. So that's why I think a Nordic network like Digital is absolutely a gift. It's a gift to us who are lucky enough to participate, but it's a particular gift, I think, to the Nordic societies and to Nordic children. And I hope that will resonate in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for pinpointing some of the dichotomies in the field and the discourse around digitalization, and also showing some wonderful empirical examples and windows of opportunities for learning and also research. So